Okay, Parshas Bshalach. So Parshas Bshalach deals with the leaving of the Jews from Mitzrayim and also of the splitting of the sea, the miracle of the man. A lot of amazing things that happen in this week's Parsha. It's interesting that there are certain sections of the Torah that when you call people to the Torah, you're not allowed to make interruptions in those sections, meaning that normally we have 7 aliyot on Shabbat, but you can split into more aliyot if you want. But there are certain sections of the Torah that you're not allowed to make smaller sections from them. You can't split them into 2 aliyot. One of them, for example, is the tochachas, the curses that are leveled against the Jewish people, both in Parshas Bechukosai and also in Parshas Kisavo. We're not allowed to split them into pieces. The same as the last 8 psukim of the Torah. The last 8 psukim of the Torah we have to read in one shot. We can't give them out to different people. And the same is true in this week's Parsha of the Shiur, of the Song at the Sea, which leads into the story with the traveling of the Jews in the desert for 3 days, and then coming to bitter water, and the waters being bitter, and then God commands Moshe to throw a bitter stick into the water becomes sweet. That also needs to be connected to the Shiur, and therefore it can't be split in the aliyos. It has to be one, the whole thing leading from one to the other has to be in one parsha, in one aliyah. And of course, one has to wonder, why can't there be any interruptions in that section? What's so critical about those 2 events, separate events, that they be maintained together? So it's very interesting that when God came to Moshe and told him to go to Paro, Moshe goes to Paro, and what happens with Paro? So Paro, it says, Yichbar Aveido, we're going to make things even worse for the Jews. So God says to Moshe, you should go again. And Moshe says to God, Umeaz basi el Paro ledaber bishmecha hebra la'amazeh. From the moment that I went to speak in your name to Paro, things unraveled and became terrible. Vatzel lo itzalti asamecha, and I was not able to rescue your people. Like I feel like a failure, and all that's going to happen is I'm going to end up causing the Jews more trouble. They're going to be more miserable. Paro is going to bear down on them even worse. So why would I bother even going? So in the next pasuk, God turns to him and says, "V'yomer Hashem el Moshe, Ata sira asher esa leParo." Said, you're going to see now what I'm going to do to Paro. In other words, hang on, stop, Moshe. Don't jump to conclusions. You went the first time, it got bad, but it's going to get better. It's not going to stay this way. Ata sira, now you're going to see asher esa leParo, what I'm going to do to Paro. Ki biyad chazaki yishalchem ubiyad chazaki yigashim min me'artzo. That he's going to send them out with a strong hand, and with a strong hand, he's going to drive them from his land. You don't have to worry, I'm going to squeeze him so hard that he's going to think that he's getting rid of the Jews. Now, this is the greatness. The fascinating thing is that the Medrash says, if you look carefully at the words in verse 23, chapter 5, verse 23, Umei uz basi, Moshe says to God, may uz, from then, meaning that he was looking at that moment as being a terrible moment. And then later, when he realizes the incredible miracles that happened to the Jews, and that God Taka got them out of Mitzrayim, and look at all of the incredible things that he did, Moshe wanted to do tshuva. He realized that he made a mistake when he said Me'az Basi, that he wasn't looking at the whole picture. So Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to publicly apologize for this. When was the best time to do that? When he sang a song of thanksgiving to God for all of the miracles that he did. And that's why that section of the Torah begins with the word uz. Uz Yasher Moshe. Moshe said, "May uz basi." I came from the moment that I came, things were terrible, and Moshe undid that by saying, "Uz Yasher." So then will I sing to God, as if to say, I did damage with the word uz, that I didn't trust enough, and I didn't rely on God enough, and therefore I'm going to repair that with an uz Yasher. I'm going to repair that with this song that I'm about to sing. So why was it necessary for Moshe Rabbeinu to undo the uz? What was the problem really with the uz? He said, "Me uz basi," from the moment that I came, and here's uz Yasher. It's like a totally different context and totally different thing. So I think we have to say like this: Every single thing that happened to us in Mitzrayim was happening to us as a preamble to the receiving of the Torah. All the lessons that we were taught were lessons that we needed to be able to accept the Torah, to assimilate the Torah, to make the Torah part of our lives. From the steps that we were taking, to the decisions that we were making, to all of the events that were happening to us, on some level it was a preparation for Matan Torah. The commandments that we were given in Mitzrayim were not only commandments that were needed as foundations for a Jewish nation, but they were foundations for a nation that was tied to the Torah. There were many midos, many characteristics that we needed to be able to acquire in order to be able to become a nation and to receive the Torah. One of them that is critical for learning of Torah, the learning of Torah is not a simple thing. And the reason that it's not simple is not because the Torah is not simple and straightforward, but because the depth of the Torah is unfathomable. We know that the Torah was written, and I'll probably mention this in the next couple of weeks more than once, but the Torah was black fire written on white fire. The black fire written on white fire, which sounds like such a Kabbalistic idea, is really a very practical idea. The black we can see. When it's held up against white, it becomes very easy for us to see. The white represents the depths of the Torah that's really God's Torah. It's the part of the Torah that God understands. The black Torah, that's the part that we've been privy to understand and to be able to get from the Torah. That when we study Torah, we recognize that there is so much depth behind what we're learning. There's so much depth behind what's there. When we start to uncover it, it's incredible. But it takes time. We would love it to be simple. We'd love it to be like you flip on a recorder and it just talks to you and you assimilate the Torah. It goes into the depths. But it doesn't work that way. There are things that have to be worked out. There are kinks. There are twists and turns that we need to work out in our head. There are connections that need to be made. Once we have the surface of Torah, then we have to deal with it on the level of depth. And an incredibly important foundation that we have to have is that when things get tough, the tough keep going. My mother used to live by when things get tough, the tough go shopping. But that was a whole separate thing. But when things get tough, the tough have to keep going. Moshe Rabbeinu needed to teach them that even when life becomes difficult and it seems to be tough, he turned to God and he said, Me'oz basi. From that moment, it's all been terrible. It's all been bad because Moshe Rabbeinu was looking at only that slice, only that moment. But he had to get the message of don't be frightened, keep pushing. Because when you get the whole picture, then Oz Yasher Moshe. Then when you understand the entire thing, you understand the difficulty that you went through that got you to another place. Whether it's completely pleasant or not, but it got you to another place. There's a purpose for it. In the end, we have to recognize that the greater the darkness, ultimately the greater the clarity. And that message needed to be taught to the Jewish people before they were given the Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu had to be the conduit to teach that message of Me'oz and Oz, that from when you focus just on the now, you will often never get to see and to realize the Oz Yasher, to be able to see the beauty. But if you can look at now and recognize you got to push, don't worry, don't let it snow you under, don't let it bring you down. Because if you just hang on and persevere, there is an Oz Yasher waiting at the end of this. God wanted to give that message to the Jewish people. But that message that Moshe Rabbeinu delivered to the Jewish people could have remained just an intellectual message. It could have remained just a cute idea. And perhaps it could have even been missed. Moshe Rabbeinu said, Me'oz basi. Now he says, he realizes that he has to undo that Oz basi. He has to undo that inability to be able to see the bigger picture and to be able to just push on to see the joy. And therefore what God wanted was he wanted to give a mashal to the Jewish people. He wanted them to experience this with their eyes so that it would be a lesson that was indelibly marked on their souls. And that's why he brought them to the Mei Marah. He brought them to the bitter waters. 3 days, just 3 days after all this incredible stuff happened, the incredible miracles, where it started to sink in. Do you realize what just happened to us over the past year? The miracles that we witnessed, Dam Tzvardei Akinim, the incredible things that we saw. The miracle of no Egyptian rising up against us when we took their God and tied it to our bedposts. That there was no rebellion, there was no danger. We walked out of Mitzrayim that had kept us slaves for all of these years. They chased after us and we crossed over the sea and they were destroyed in the sea. When they saw all this incredible miracles, and then they come to the bitter waters. And when they come to the bitter waters, they start to complain. And they look at it and they say, "Oy, now what are we going to drink? What are we going to live on in the desert?" And it was at that moment that they focused on that moment and they saw only the smallness of that moment. They didn't see the big picture. They didn't connect what was happening to them. So then at that moment, God told Moshe to take a bitter stick, take more of the bitterness, persevere through it, and what in the end is going to happen? It's going to become sweet. It's going to become beautiful, sweet, drinkable water. Sham sam leichaiku mishpat. It was there that he gave them the chayk u'mishpat. He gave them statutes and laws. Not just the statutes and laws, which our rabbis say that they gave them paraduma and Shabbos and honoring parents. But in that place, they got those laws because they were given the basis. They were given the foundation for laws. The foundation for learning Torah and to be successful in learning Torah. Normally, when something's bitter in front of you, you put sugar inside of it. You put something sweet in it. But what God taught them was, no, sometimes you have to push through the bitterness. Sometimes it's going to get even more bitter. But in the end, it's going to become mataik. In the end, it's going to become sweet. Keep moving forward. Torah is difficult. Learning is difficult. Growing is difficult. But don't switch. Don't change courses. Just persevere. And in the end, it's going to be sweet. But you have to ask, why did they complain when they got to these bitter waters? After all that happened to them and all of the great gifts that they got from God? So the Torah tells us, Ki morim heim. Everybody translate that because the water was bitter. Ki morim heim, because the Jews were bitter. Because they hadn't yet understood that when it looks tough, if you push, the sweetness is at the end. Oh, they saw it from Moshe, but they didn't experience it themselves. And that's why God brought them to Marah. You know, the Torah tells us, Vayelchu shlesh yomim v'lo matzu mayim. They walked in the desert for 3 days, and they didn't lo matzu mayim. They didn't find water. And our rabbis tell us that what does it mean they didn't find water? It means that they didn't find Torah. Now, it's a beautiful metaphor, but at the end of the day, it says in the Torah, they didn't find Mayim. It doesn't say anything about Torah. So how did our rabbis know that V'lo Matzu Mayim means that they didn't find Torah? And that's the reason why we instituted that there's the Kriyas HaTorah on Monday, on Thursday, on Shabbos afternoon, so that you never go more than 3 days without the public studying of Torah. Because of look what happened when they walked for 3 days in the desert. But they walked for 3 days, they didn't find water. No, our rabbis say it was definitely Torah. How do we know that? Because if after everything that happened, and you walk for 3 days, and you think that that water is bitter, and you think that there's no end to this, and you think that there's no sweetness going to come from this, so then it's only because you disconnected yourself from truth. You disconnected yourself from God. You disconnected yourself from His Torah. You disconnected yourself from the outlook and the realization that the bitterness, if you hang on, will always become sweet. And therefore, they reacted to the bitterness and they could see nothing positive because they focused on that moment and they didn't see big picture. And after they experienced this, it became indelibly marked in their psyche, in their soul, in the collective Jewish soul. And that's the reason why God wanted these two sections to be next to each other. He wanted the lesson of Oz Yashir and Oz Basi to be indelibly etched in the Jewish mind through their experience. We can see it through the words Oz, and then we see it through our experience. That we get to this water, it all looks bitter because we're focusing on the now, and God sends us the message, persevere and hold on to it, because in the end, it is going to be sweet. You know, it's amazing. Look at maror. We eat on Pesach by the Seder, we eat maror. Normally, when a food is bitter, we don't make a bracha on it. If a food is rotten or a food is bitter, if a food is sharp, and it's not really something that people eat alone, so then we don't make a bracha. On Pesach, we make a bracha on the bitterness. We make a bracha on maror. Because on Pesach, the entire Seder gives us the message that if the bitterness will turn to sweetness. Did you ever wonder why at the Seder we say the Hallel in two parts? We never split the Hallel. Hallel is always said in one piece. We make a bracha in the beginning, we say all the way through until the end. Pesach night, we say the first two paragraphs, and then we take a break, we eat, we bench, and matzah, and then we say the rest of the Pesach, the rest of the Hallel. Because the beginning part of the Hallel is all about the Exodus of Egypt. The end of the Hallel is all about what's going to come from here, about the salvation, about Yemos HaMashiach, about all of the blessings that God has in store for us. First, we experience the bitterness, and only then we come to the sweetness. And that's why we can make a bracha on maror on Pesach, because we recognize that the merirus, that bitterness, if we would have checked out early, as one of the tribes did, it would have brought destruction on us. But if we just hang on in the end, Oz Yasher. If we focus on Oz Basi, from that moment it was so terrible to us, so then we'll miss the Oz Yasher. But if we just hang on, then we'll see the song and the beauty. You look at the next section, after the story of the bitter water. The Torah says, V'yavo Elima. They came to a place called Elim. V'sham shtei mesrei einos mayim. There were 12 springs of water. V'shivim timarim. And 70 date palms. V'yachnu sham al hamayim. And we rested there by the water. It's a little curious to you. There were 12 date palms there. Not 14 date palms, not 17 date palms, not 2. There were 12 date palms in this place. And there were 70 trees. How many tribes were there? 12 tribes. How many sages were there? How many elders were there? There were Shivim Zakenim. There were 70. How interesting. Davka 12 Einot Mayim and 70 trees. Rashi and the Ramban say that these things were planted already from the beginning of the world, waiting there for when the Jews need them. What do we need? Subtle message of 12 and 70? What was the message? The message was the place that we came to, a place of Elim, the place of palm trees. Because what's fascinating is that date palms are bitter trees with amazing fruit. And they're called palm trees, not just date trees, so that we constantly remember that from the palm, from the tree, which is so bitter, comes this amazing fruit. You know, we say on a Friday night in Psalms, Tzadik katamar yifrach, that a righteous person should grow like a tamar, not like a cedar tree, not like an apple tree, not like an acorn tree, but it should grow like a tamar, because that's how you become a tzaddik. Sometimes you experience bitterness, and if you hold onto it, that bitterness will turn to sweetness. Tzidkus is born, righteousness is born when we hold on and recognize that if we just persevere and we just push through, the bracha is waiting for us around the corner. And that's why we say in Tehillim that Torah is mesukim midvash v'noifes sufim. It's sweeter than honey and dripping honeycombs. But sometimes to get to that sweetness, sometimes you've got to persevere a lot. And not always at the end does it work out the exact way you thought it was going to work out. But in that darkness, in that difficulty, in that mirirut, you can feel and see and taste the metikut. You can taste the sweetness. And that's the message that God sends us in Parshas Bshalach, in the structure. In the uz and uz, in the story of the splitting of the sea, juxtaposed next to the story of the bitter waters, and then bringing us to this place of absolute sweetness and sending us these 70 date palms to remind us that if through the bitterness will ultimately come the sweetness. My thought. It's also interesting that this always comes, this Parsha, somewhere around Tu B'Shvat, either Shabbos before or Shabbos after, because there are many connections between this concept and the concept of seeing the depths of things, of not looking on the surface, and just waiting for the depths to take shape, and then you'll see their incredible things. Okay. My thoughts.
Rabbi, I don't know if anyone else...
that the tree was bitter that Moshe had tossed into the bitter water, but I don't see that in the Pshat.
Right. So it's based on a medrash that he told him to throw in the what's called the tree, and the tree itself was also bitter. But it's not. It doesn't say it. It doesn't say it in the text. But it says vayashlech alamayim. It says vayoreu Hashem eitz. God showed him a tree, and vayashlech alamayim, and he threw that tree into the water. So I think the Medrash learns that tree was a bitter tree. I mean, if you take it out of metaphors, it's really an incredible thing. When you're learning Torah, so one of the things that we try very hard, and very often when people start learning Torah a little later in life, so then what happens is that it's difficult when you're a child and your mind is trained to think a certain way. So then as you grow with Torah, right? So you can start to understand deeper things, and you can start to grapple with more serious problems. I always found when I taught in high school, it was always frustrating to me when I would speak to a 10th grader and I would speak to a 2nd grader, and they would give me the same explanation for the holidays, which means that they hadn't been been taught to think deeper and to recognize deeper things. That's a problem in general in Jewish day schools, of a curriculum issue of not always having the ability to be able to recognize that you teach the basics here and then you deepen them and you have to keep going deeper. Well, when a person starts learning Torah later, that's often a difficulty, because it's hard to learn the basic things, because they seem so simple, and it's difficult also to learn the more detailed things because the skills aren't there. So the advice we always give to a person is just hang on, and very often I'll use this Parshas Bshalach to accentuate this idea that God didn't say throw sugar in. God said throw a piece of wood in. Through another piece of wood, which again, as the Medrash says, is bitterness. That sometimes you just have to add bitterness. You have to just keep persevering, and it just tastes more bitter. Because it just seems like, okay, great, so you tell me I have to learn more. Shkoyach, I'm learning more, and I'm still not getting a geschmack out of this. It's still not enjoyable. And I'll do more, and it's still not enjoyable. And then all of a sudden, and I want you to know, I had an experience, as I'm talking now, I just realized I had an experience this morning. Oh, unbelievable. God is so awesome. It's just coming into my head now. I give it a Hebrew Daf Yomi. I'm just doing a temporary fill-in for somebody who was giving me the Yomi had a baby, whatever you can't give. So I'm giving it in Hebrew. I know it's shocking, totally shocking, but I'm giving it in Hebrew. And the guys are not rebelling against my Hebrew. It's incredible. And they're all Israelis. If you listen to it objectively, it's the closest dialect to Hebrew that one could possibly muster. But nevertheless, I'm doing my best. So this guy comes to me and he says to me, it happened 35 minutes ago. He said to me, I'm so thoroughly enjoying learning with you. He says, because I have a very difficult time learning Gemara. It's a very difficult time. And I most of the time don't understand a thing. He said, but you're, I'm learning and learning and learning and learning. And I'm thinking to myself, like, what am I doing? And then this morning, like the gates opened and all of a sudden stuff started to fall in. Whatever, I was explaining something this morning, a little bit of a complicated thing. I explained it in a way that he was able to resonate with it, but that he realized that if he just sticks it out, all of a sudden it became sweet. And it was like, he was like jumping, he was dancing, he was so happy that he understood it. Yesterday, had somebody said to him, "Nu, how's your learning going?" This guy would have said, Zakashali, it's so difficult. And today, if you ask him, how's your learning? He'll say, sweet like honey. Because that's what happens if you just stick and push. Use the God-given talents and mind that you've been given and just continue to persevere. Eventually the sweetness will come. And this is true in all of life. The more we hold on, eventually we see the purpose, the reason, the message. The message is not always unicorns and butterflies. Sometimes the message is more difficult. But we'll see that message. And knowing the message will bring us a certain sweetness. Okay. Everybody should have a beautiful day, an amazing day. Appreciate Eretz Yisrael and our opportunity to live there. And the Peiros Eretz Yisrael, the gifts of fruit that God has given us. And though it takes fruit a long time to grow, but then we wait, we persevere, and the sweetness comes to us. Have a beautiful day. Have a beautiful Shabbos. And in Yirtzeh Hashem, we'll see everybody on Sunday morning.
Sure, Rabbi. Same to all of you. Bye.
Awesome.
Thank you, Rabbi, very much.
Thank you.
My
That was
pleasure.
great. Thank you so
My
much.
pleasure. Thank you.